When we get to Ovid's treatment of the Trojan War, we're moving into a different kind of genre. We're moving in from an epic treatment of the Trojan War that we've seen in Homer and we've seen in Virgil, into something that we might call a mock epic. There's something different happening in Ovid's treatment of this, and he's having fun with us all the way through this story. If, as you're reading, you find yourself on this long digression that seems tangential and you're not sure how in the world that's related to the main action of the Trojan War, you're onto it. You've got it right. Ovid is bringing us off into parts of the story that don't really seem quite to fit. We'll talk about what his message is in closing, but let's try to get a grip on what's happening in Ovid's version of the Trojan War. First of all, let's just do a thought experiment. Imagine a documentary covering World War II from the middle of the last century, and imagine in that documentary that there's no mention at all of D-Day. There's also hardly any battle scenes at all. In fact, there's one, though, long, bloody kind of battle-ish scene when you've got General George Patton, who fights someone you've never heard of. He has a really hard time of it, and then he eventually pushes a guy over and then just strangles him and smashes him with his club. There's an older colonel who goes off on a long digression and starts prattling on and on and on about a time when he was a young guy and there was a pack of bears that came along and they had to have a long fight to fight off the pack of bears. And his story takes up nearly a third of the documentary that treats World War II. Some old guy talking about when he was young and they fought off a pack of bears. That's like a third of the coverage of World War II. Then on the Allied side, two top officers argue over who gets to keep General George Patton's pearl-handled pistols. Let's just say, for sake of argument, Patton gets killed in the middle of the action, and he's got these pearl-handled pistols, and the two great officers from the Allied side fight over who gets to keep them. The documentary mentions that the Axis countries fall, and then we take a long look at the plight of the Japanese emperor's family and all the suffering that happens, and we talk about how the Allies savagely firebombed Tokyo. And that will be the end of the treatment of World War II. You might say to yourself, well, that's weird, and it's focusing on certain pieces and making them seem really important. What's with that whole digression about the pack of bears, and why is that in there? That's the same kind of reaction you probably should have to Ovid's treatment of the Trojan War. Let's see a look at an outline of the main action as it happens, and then we'll try to figure out what he's up to. We've got a departure for Troy, and in that departure we hear about Iphigenia, but in Ovid's version she's saved at the last minute. Diana substitutes a deer instead of her. There's a change that happens. And then we jump off and we hear about Achilles. The great Greek warrior Achilles. He's a killing machine in Homer. He's extraordinarily good at it. He carries it tough. He carries it in a way that makes it clear it's a tough burden for him to shoulder. But he knows what he's doing. He's kind of an elegant killer. And in the scene that Ovid chooses to pull out is Achilles against Cygnus. And if you haven't heard of Cygnus as a famous warrior, well, it's because Cygnus is not a famous warrior. It's a small-in battle. We've got Achilles compared to a bull. There's that rich simile that talks about him as a bull. How does that make him look? And then we've got, in the end, he just takes Cygnus and beats his face in with a shield, and finally he chokes him to death. Well, this is not elegant killing. It's not the kind of thing that Homer talks about. Achilles is able to use sharp bronze weapons to take the life of other people in dramatically efficient ways. Here's an inefficient, cloddish, cumbersome, bull-like, overwhelming brute force, using brute force of one guy against a not very famous guy. That doesn't seem very glorious or heroic. Then we get to the Battle of the Lapis and the Centaurs. This is that thing that takes like about a third of Ovid's recounting of the war at Troy, focuses in on this. How do we get onto this topic? If you don't remember, that's probably just about fine. You are catching that Ovid has only a very tangential relation between this whole thing and the Trojan War. In fact, it comes out of Nestor's mouth. And Nestor is traditionally a guy who likes to talk. He's an old man and he likes to hear his own voice, as old people do. As I get older, I'm finding that that's true. My voice sounds more and more mellifluous as the years go by. How does Nestor get on to the topic of telling everyone in all gory detail about the Battle of Lapis and the Centaurs? Well, he just decides he wants to talk about Caeneus. And this Caeneus was once a woman, and he wished he could be turned into a man to avoid being raped again, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And then all of a sudden we start hearing about him as a Lapith and how they fought off the centaurs. In other words, there's really no connection. Nestor just kind of prattling. And all of a sudden we jump on into this long battle-like scene where Lapiths, who we don't necessarily care that much about, are killing centaurs who we care nothing about. What we've got in the way he frames things, the way Ovid frames things, is a kind of triumph of gruesomeness and gore for gore's sake over heroism. He focuses in on these nasty beasts getting ripped apart, and there's gory detail after gory detail. Homer himself spends a lot of time with gory detail, but by contrast, in most of the cases that Homer does that, we care about the person that's getting ripped up. Here, the centaurs, they play a role that's kind of like the role that zombies play in contemporary horror movies. Zombies are there in order to just get ripped up, and you watch their green, gooey, gore blood splatter everywhere. Well, the centaurs are a little bit like that. You're just going to watch them get sort of sliced to bits, and you sort of think, oh, well, look at that. That's sort of exciting. A famous case of old, they're debauched creatures, these centaurs. They're men and beasts together. We don't really admire them. What we've got, instead of a grand heroic scene with people on one side and people on another fighting over a great cause, we've got gore for gore's sake. It's just gruesomeness. And then we jump back and all of a sudden get back to our digressive moment of Caeneus, and oh yeah, he was there too. We hear about that. Okay, all of a sudden Ovid has brought us through this long, gory detail that doesn't really have much at all to do with the Trojan War. Then we hear about the death of Achilles. Yes, indeed. We just hear about it. He dies. And the way he dies is by a cheap shot from the peanut gallery. You've got Paris, who's not very, of all of the Trojan princes, Paris is not the greatest of warriors, and he fights with bow and arrow. That's never coded as being a very brave thing. Bow and arrow fighters fight from far away, and they kind of ping, and then they run off. So this arrow flies, and it hits Achilles, and poor Achilles, who's depicted here on this vase, dead Achilles being dragged along. He gets pushed aside. But it's just a small, tiny mention. It's not as though there's anything grand and grandiose that has happened. In our next lecture, we'll look at another piece of how this Trojan War is framed. After Achilles is dead, there's going to be an argument over who gets to keep his arms.